Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back. It's been a while. How are you guys doing? I've missed chatting with you, and it's been a long time coming, but sometimes a little break is needed from a podcast. I wear a lot of other hats outside of podcasting and being a therapist, and sometimes my days just can run together if I'm not careful. So, a little break is needed to kind of come back to reality, reset, restart, reboot, all of that kind of good stuff. But how have you guys been? I hope that you have been doing okay. And I want to kind of jump in there. And of course, if you're new here, welcome. If you are a return listener, thanks so much for being a supporter. If you like what you hear, please be sure to subscribe, like, share. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to comment down below in our comment sections. I do read those. And if you're a follower on social media of A Date with Darkness podcast, when we post about the podcast up there, please feel free to drop a comment down there as well. I've been thinking about, sort of recording the podcast live and maybe answering like listener questions live. Let me know if that's something that you guys would like. It's been a long time since I've done a live episode of the podcast. You guys get always like the edited version where, everything runs smoothly and things like that. But I think it would be kind of fun to do a live stream on YouTube. So let me know what you think about that, and if you would be down to do a live with me. I think that would be fun, kind of like a QA, listener QA. And I think it would be kind of nice to do something like that. The podcast is officially 6 years old, believe it or not, this month. So we are celebrating our 6-year anniversary, and we'll need to we'll definitely do like a special anniversary section, a special anniversary podcast, and to celebrate our 6-year anniversary. And I can't believe it's been that long, but it has. All right, so enough of that, and I want to kind of dive into today's podcast. So today's podcast is a part 2 of a podcast that I think I released last year with Dr. Virgil Zeilgler-Hill. And it was, at the time I had taken this section of the podcast out. I'm very particular about the information that I put out there, and I want to be intentional and respectful. One of the reasons that I brought him on the podcast was to talk about narcissism in the Black community. And, because he was part of a published research study that had been done some time ago that talked about how narcissistic traits are highest in the Black community. One of the original researchers that was the inspiration for doing this study in the first place has since passed on. And so it wasn't his study, but one in that he participated in gathering. And let me tell you a little bit about why I hesitated on publishing the second part of that podcast, and a little bit about why I want to do it now. So first of all, way back in the day, it feels like, a lifetime ago, there was a time in my life where I was a researcher, had done research studies, worked as a research assistant, and had done that for quite some time. And so with studies in particular on African American folks, you have to be very careful about the stuff that you put out there. You know, in my mind, you want to be very careful, especially if it's not controlled, if the research isn't controlled for like cultural components. And so those are reasons why. And then it's always, I'm always hesitant whenever the person that's sort of conducting or speaking about the research is white, I'll be honest, just because, you know, during my time as a researcher, you know, and kind of going through and doing literature reviews and things like that, you know, research studies that have been conducted by white researchers on groups of Black people haven't been very kind. They haven't painted us in a good light. And not that research should be biased to always paint us in a favorable light, but I felt like the research was actually quite the opposite, in that it's always painted Black folks to be in a negative light, to be poor or of low socioeconomic status, that, you know, children come from families with substance abuse and things like that. So I'm always careful about, you know, research and things like that I quote. Furthermore, you know, when you're talking about like assessment measures, you want to make sure that any sort of assessment measure that you're using, such as one that would be measuring traits of narcissism, is culturally normed. And a lot of assessments are not culturally normed or controlled for the appropriate population. A lot of assessments have been normed according to what is appropriate for white culture, and that's very different for people of color. And that does matter when you're saying that this assessment has categorized a certain group of people as having this trait, which isn't thought of as favorable. I do, however, want to put, you know, I did decide to go ahead and publish a podcast after thinking about it, because I'm like, there is some useful information, as long as I put this disclaimer on it and let you know that, you know, and Dr. Hill and I, we talked about how it wasn't culturally normed and statistically normed for our population, and that there does need to be a lot more research in the area of narcissism or narcissistic traits in the African American community, and differentiating healthy forms of narcissism from pathological narcissism, which is also, you know, another reason that gives me pause, because, you know, if you're not careful, you know, certain traits in the African American community can be pathologized, whereas in other cultures, they may be highlighted and celebrated. And, you know, we call that cultural appropriation. And so again, that, you know, when you put research in the wrong hands, or when you give it to the people, and they decide to use it for the wrong reasons, you know, you just don't want to add to that, if that makes sense. I don't. But if it can be helpful in any way, and there can be certain things that can be drawn from it, let's talk about it, and maybe more research can be done in that area. And I would love to get on a research team and maybe do more research in this area, because it's been a long time since I've done research and I kind of miss it. But it can be laborious, it can be tedious and cumbersome, but it can also be very rewarding, very eye-opening, and help you discover some things. So I may be getting back into it here. But anyhow, so Dr. Hill and I, we had a very fruitful discussion about this. And so, you know, here's the second part of our podcast that we did last year. So I was sort of researching, as I do for the show, and you had written there was a journal article I saw where you were talking about Black folks having higher levels of narcissism.
Sure. So yeah, so my interest in this topic came from some work when I moved to the University of Southern Mississippi in 2004. I was doing a lot of self-esteem work, And what I was finding was consistently, we would find racial ethnic group differences in self-esteem. And the university population at Southern Mississippi was essentially about 60% white, about 40% Black, and really almost no Hispanics, like no, like it was very much a white-Black sort of population for the undergraduates. Yeah, which is very different from every other undergraduate institution where I've ever been, where there, oftentimes you would find, a fairly significant number of Hispanic students, Asian students, and so on. There, it was largely white, and Black. And what we'd find in this study after study is that the Black students would have usually small to medium differences, but always in the same direction, where they always reported higher levels of self-esteem than our white students. And when I started looking into the issue, I found that people had been writing about this for a long time. At the time, I really ran across it. And part of what folks had been interested in for a long time is that sort of pattern didn't align with some of the models of understanding self-esteem. The most popular model was this idea referred to as the internalization of stigma idea. And the basic argument is that if someone is a member of a stigmatized group, and if they're aware of that stigma, then it would make sense from certain perspectives that their self-esteem would be lower. And in fact, the internalization of stigma idea, you see that play out from across a wide array of groups. So for example, people who are overweight, people who are from a lower socioeconomic status class, people who have some sort of disability, all these groups that are stigmatized will frequently report low levels of self-esteem. And people had recognized for a long time before I got around to this issue that one of the exceptions to this pattern was in the US for Black individuals who are frequently highly stigmatized, but yet report high levels of self-esteem. And so there was this disconnect about, well, how is this work? It doesn't match the internalization of stigma idea. And so Jenny Crocker and Brenda Major developed the first real argument, I would say, to kind of address this, which was the stigma self-protection idea. And so what they argued is that in some cases, individuals from a stigmatized group might actually view their stigma, be able to use their stigma in such a way that it protects them from the negative self-esteem consequences. So there were a couple different avenues that they talked about how this could work. So for example, if an individual is a member of a stigmatized group, if they have some sort of negative experience, so a student gets a bad grade on an English paper, if they are able to attribute the negative experience to being a member of this stigmatized group. So it's not that I'm a bad writer, it's that my teacher, has something against my group. It protects their self-esteem. That was one of the sorts of avenues that they thought could explain this sort of approach. Now, and I think it's a very interesting idea. The issue comes that it doesn't explain all of these patterns terribly well. I mean, it can explain some patterns. Like for example, it can explain the Black self-esteem advantage that people had been noting in the literature, but it doesn't explain, for example, why overweight individuals would still be reporting lower levels of self-esteem. So if stigma can protect us, why is it only happening for some groups and not for others? And so I think they had a really interesting argument. It just didn't explain everything. And I don't think any of our explanations to date explain everything. So to start to answer your question, that's how I got interested in this topic. Was I saw an issue in the literature that I still didn't have an explanation for. Now, 20 years since I became interested in this, we still don't have an explanation for it. Some people have done some investigations and tried to understand what's going on, but I still don't think we have a really thorough understanding of what's happening in this area.
When you talk about the self-esteem, what components of self-esteem are they looking at?
Sure. So those earliest studies were looking at global self-esteem. So basically, how do people feel about themselves on average, in general.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my first real foray into this issue was I've been interested in the idea of fragile self-esteem for a long time. So when we think about self-esteem, we have kind of our general global self-esteem. How does an individual feel about themselves on average? And self-esteem can range from people who generally feel quite poorly about themselves, people who feel great about themselves all the time. My first real movement into this was through a related construct called contingent self-esteem. And what contingent self-esteem deals with is basically what are the bases for our feelings of self-worth. That is, do we base our feelings of self-worth on particular domains or not? So, for example, some people will base their feelings of self-worth on their physical appearance. So if they feel like they look good, then they feel great about themselves. If they feel like they look not so great, they feel awful about themselves. Where for some people, their appearance just doesn't matter that much to them. They, if they look great, so what? If they look awful, they don't care that much either. But for some people, it's really like the fundamental core of their self-esteem. So what some of my, or I guess this first study I did by myself, and what we did, or what I did across a series of studies, is I looked at white college students and Black college students at the University of Southern Mississippi. And I looked at some of the basic domains that people tend to use as the basis for their self-esteem. So these involve things like the approval of others, physical appearance, outdoing other people in competition, academic competence, and so on. And what I found was that there were 7 basic areas of contingency. And across a series of 3 or 4 studies, I think 3 or 4, what we found is that white students consistently had greater contingencies in 5 of the areas. So basically all of the areas, with the exception of God's love, which was the only contingency that Black students actually had higher levels of than white students. And there were no differences in any of the studies for academic competence. So that was the one area where Black and white students were perfectly equal. Black students reported higher levels of basing their self-esteem on God's love. And then for every other area, white students were higher. So others' approval, outdoing others in competition, appearance, family love and support, basically all those areas, white students were reporting these more fragile feelings of self-worth. The reason why I say they're more fragile is the argument is that if people have contingencies, then those are indicators of potential fragility, because you can only feel good about yourself if you're performing well in these areas. So, for example, if you're really basing your self-esteem on the approval of others, you can only feel good if you think other people are approving of you. And so this was really my first area where I was going beyond what people had been looking at previously with self-esteem level, showing that there were these racial differences in these contingencies, and that those racial differences in the contingencies also seem to help explain to at least some extent the general self-esteem difference that we were seeing. So there were some mediational analyses we conducted showing that part of the reason why white students were reporting lower levels of self-esteem than Black students was because of this tendency for white students to base their feelings of self-worth on the approval of others. And so, if anything, it started to suggest that maybe one of the protective factors for Black students was actually this lack of willingness to kind of base their self-esteem on what other people thought of them. We had some speculation in that part of this might be taught by parents, and we didn't have any direct evidence of that. But the idea is, if you're raising your children in a society where you know that they're going to be experiencing a lot of racism over the course of their lives, it might make sense to kind of help protect them from that by saying, don't listen to what society if society is telling you you're not worthy, don't listen to that. And so we thought that might be one of the protective messages that were somehow being communicated to students. And I'm guessing that part of that was probably through parents.
What do you feel like were some of the factors that were relative to the white students in terms of why theirs was lower? Was there any sort of thought about or talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's this. I think it's a similar sort of thing. I think what's happening with individuals is if you are basing your feelings of self-worth on any sort of external approval, it it's inherently fragile.
Mm,
Whether that's about your appearance or competition or simply the approval of others, there's always the risk that other people aren't going to approve of you, and
mhm,
that you could easily see some drop in your feelings of self-esteem. Now, one of the so contingent self-esteem tends to get kind of a bad rap, I think, in general. And so when social personality psychologists look at contingent self-esteem, we almost exclusively talk about it as being a bad thing. And there's a really good reason for that. It's associated with a whole host of bad outcomes, a lot of anxiety, depression, and so on.
sure.
So there's a good reason why people are not advocating that we want our kids to be more contingent. I think there's a good reason for that. However, there has been an argument that I think is a good one, that there could actually be kind of a curvilinear relationship between contingent self-esteem and general kind of psychological health. So, for
Mm,
example, if we take like academic achievement, if someone doesn't base any of their feelings of self-worth on their academic achievement, and you're a 20-year-old college student, what that could do is it could potentially suggest that maybe you aren't heavily invested in your academic success. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't want someone, every bit of self-esteem they have, to be completely and utterly kind of wrapped up in their academic achievement.
mhm,
But is there kind of a middle point where maybe that's kind of a psychological health may not be a kind of all or nothing sort of consequence? It may be that maybe some contingency in some of these areas maybe isn't an awful thing.
mm.
There have been arguments on this front, but the data has not been great as far as looking to see if maybe kind of modest levels of contingency in some of these areas maybe isn't too bad for us.
Yeah.
Part of what led to that argument was people were arguing that optimal self-esteem, kind of perfect or the best form of self-esteem, would be completely non-contingent, which is kind of odd when you think about it. I mean, if what you're arguing is that for people to have kind of this perfect sense of self-worth, it wouldn't have any kind of connection to how they're doing in any area of their life, is a little odd. I mean, when it has kind of this Pollyanna-ish sort of feel to it that just doesn't kind of fit with what we would normally want people to be experiencing. We would normally want their evaluations of themselves to have some correspondence to what's actually going on and how they're actually performing in their lives.
Okay. Okay. And so do you think that that may be a contributing factor into also why Black students may not score as highly as white students? And then, the first thought that came to my mind was mediating and moderating factors,
Absolutely.
such as, the media,
Mhm.
and, just all the other sort of factors that may come into play, privilege, um, and media would be two of the biggest factors that I would also consider as well.
No, I think those could absolutely play a huge role. Especially when you're looking at issues like the physical appearance contingency.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about media, when you have these representations of what is beautiful, what is attractive, what is acceptable,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some biased representations in terms of how beauty is presented.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely think that plays a role. The studies that I was conducting, well, all the studies I was running on this topic were all conducted in the southern United States,
Mm-hmm.
which also has its own share of complications in terms of how you interpret what's coming, what everything means. Um, Now, interestingly, for some of the self-esteem work that was done by other folks, what they found when they did kind of broad national samples is that some of the biggest differences between Black and white students in terms of self-esteem level actually happened in the South, which, you know, for those who know anything about the South, you know, if you didn't know that was the pattern, if anything, you might think that the difference would be at its smallest there, because the racism in the American South, it is not terribly heavily veiled. I mean, it's right there on the surface in some cases. And so
Yeah.
from a purely pragmatic point of view, you would think that the internalization of stigma argument might kind of hold up in the American South, where there is so much racism and it's kind of right there on the surface. But what researchers have found is that's actually where the Black self-esteem advantage tends to be the largest, is in that part of the country, which goes back to that stigma, self-protection as being maybe part of what's going on. But I think your other arguments about things like media and those sorts of issues also probably play a role as well.
Media, and then I think the biggest factor that I've thought of too is the intergenerational cycles. It, you know, just of having to do that. Whereas with, for example, like handicap, as you mentioned, with there being some exceptions, intergenerationally, there's not going to be the same handicap demonstrated over and over. Whereas, as you were mentioning, you know, racism and those sort of things, those things are demonstrated over and over. And it would be interesting to compare different regions of that. You know, like you said, in the South, it's very overt, versus in the West, like California and other places like that, it's very covert. So it's, you know, things may be demonstrated there. But I'm also curious about the other leg of the research about the narcissism aspect that you were saying, because we haven't gotten there yet.
Sure. So on the narcissism side, so what I was interested in is, so since we've seen differences in self-esteem and contingent self-esteem, what I was interested in is, well, what about narcissism? Since that's so closely, it's often entwined with self-esteem in discussions. Now they're completely separate constructs. They're correlated with each other, but narcissism is very different from self-esteem. And so what I was interested in is, well, would we see the same sort of pattern showing up for narcissism that we're seeing for self-esteem, or would something completely different emerge? And so we ran this research came about in part because one of the graduate students at Southern Mississippi, who deserves credit for being part of this. Her name was Marion Wallace. She was a wonderful graduate student there, working with her mentor's name was Chris Berry, but she was very interested in self-esteem and narcissism. And so she had read my paper on contingent self-esteem, became really interested in what would this look like with other related constructs. So we ended up doing a series of studies together. She died about 3 years ago in an automobile accident. It's just horrible, but she became interested in this topic. So we decided to investigate whether narcissism we'd see similar or different sorts of associations emerging for narcissism. And so we started off looking at the most popular measure of narcissism at that time, something called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, which captures narcissism as a dimensional personality construct. And what we found were patterns that were similar to the self-esteem results that people had shown, where essentially in study after study, Black participants were reporting higher levels of narcissism than the white participants. Now, it's important to note that for narcissism, kind of like we were talking about earlier with the trifurcated kind of model, there are different aspects of narcissism. The research that we're talking about took place before we had gotten to the trifurcated sort of model. So what we were looking at there would essentially be aspects of kind of the grandiose version of narcissism, where you've got the kind of purely grandiose and some of the antagonistic elements. And so what we saw in those studies were that the Black college students were reporting higher levels of leadership authority, which is kind of pure grandiosity. This superiority kind of element, which is also kind of pure grandiosity. And the most toxic element within the narcissistic personality inventory kind of gets at that antagonistic element, which is, it's referred to as entitlement exploitation. And Black students were also reporting the higher levels in that, but the differences were much smaller than what we were getting for the kind of purely grandiose parts. And so what we were showing is that the effects were kind of similar to what we were seeing for the self-esteem effects. We then ran some follow-up studies to see, well, what if we look at more pathological kind of conceptualizations of narcissism? And there, the racial ethnic differences really didn't emerge as consistently. So it looks like where we're getting differences are on more of the kind of relatively normal personality traits of narcissism, rather than the more pathological conceptualization of narcissism.
With the tests that are used on both self-esteem and the narcissism personality inventory, do you feel like those tests have been norm referenced for those groups equally?
So no, they have
Yeah.
not. And that would be one of the things. Like if we were going to do like a replication of this today,
Mm-hmm.
the things I would love to do would be to, one, use more modern measures of narcissism. The narcissist personality inventory has a whole host of problems
Yeah.
with it. So I would, at some point, replicating this sort of work using modern measures that I think are much stronger than like the NPI was in this study.
Yeah.
So I think that would be important. Also, making sure that we really are getting the same, do the measures have the same sort of factor structure in whites as they do in blacks? Because you're absolutely right that most of the initial validation work was done primarily in college students at primarily white universities. So you would get these really high rates of white individuals participating in the validation. Now, one consequence of that is that the nature of the items may mean something a little bit different to folks. And so that's a possibility. That could it be a difference in the construct itself,
Yes.
or a different interpretation of some of the items? And I think that's definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. And then in terms of the research team, is there diversity on your research team that's also sort of studying this as well?
So there was. So Marion, she was a young African American woman when we started this work, and she was really one of the pivotal forces in this, because she was so interested in trying to understand the Black self-esteem advantage, because she thought it was such an interesting idea that she hadn't heard of until she started taking graduate level courses. So, but I completely agree that it would be really helpful to have folks from and so in the early work on this topic, they were also looking at Asian groups and Hispanic individuals, and finding that, and I think the same sorts of concerns that you're raising would also apply to other groups as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would be interesting to see, as well as the regional differences too, right? In terms of how those show up. And like what's next on the research agenda for you in terms of, exploring this topic?
So on this particular topic, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's been I think the last paper I published on this was about 10 years ago. So I don't know if I'm going to be going back to this particular
Right.
topic. I think it's interesting, and I wish
Yeah.
I wish someone would pick up this idea, at least with the self-esteem advantage, to really try
Yeah.
to get a fuller understanding of how certain groups are able to kind of protect themselves from being part of from the stigma associated with their group. Because I think that's really important to a broader understanding. I don't think this is limited to just the issue of Black and white individuals. I think the protective elements of how do individuals protect themselves. And I think one of the things that we alluded to in a couple of places, I think parenting ends up being one of those issues with if a group is experiencing stigma in this kind of intergenerational flow. I think then there's the opportunity for parents to maybe help kind of protect their children or teach them the skills to protect themselves. But even that doesn't explain the broader patterns. It could explain if we just focused on Black and white individuals, okay, that could explain it. But Hispanic individuals tend to experience relatively low levels of self-esteem. They're experiencing a tremendous amount of stigma in the US, and it's intergenerational in nature. So if it was just something about parents being able to kind of help protect their children, you would expect that group to be able to do the same thing as well. And we're not seeing that. So there's something going on in certain groups that we're not seeing in others, and identifying what that is. Like, what is it that people are doing that is actually serving as this protective factor?
Yeah.
And we still don't really know what that is. When people have found one little part of the argument and they think, oh, okay, this makes sense over here, when you kind of zoom out a little bit, you find that it doesn't explain what's happening over here. So like the stigma self-protection makes a great deal of sense. It's just it doesn't seem to explain everything that's going on because we have other groups that aren't having the same sort of benefits.
It's well said. But the other thing that I wonder about too is the inverse properties of the measurements, like where you were saying some of the white students were sort of flagging on all the other indicators. Is that actually more of an indicator of narcissism? Because I'm one of the people that I believe that while narcissists do present themselves as being very egotistical, I actually feel that it's quite the opposite. Internally, they feel empty.
Mm-hmm.
And so, or low on those, quite low, or even fractured, if you will. So I was kind of curious on what your thoughts were about that.
So I'm glad you mentioned, because we know from a number of studies now. I actually have a paper in press right now that's kind of revisiting the contingent self-esteem and narcissism connection. And so for narcissistic individuals, the biggest area of contingency is about competition. It's about outperforming other
Yes.
people. That ends up being absolutely pivotal for
Yes.
how they kind of view themselves.
Mhm.
The other areas of contingency ends up being a little messier, like the approval of others for the kind of extroverted and antagonistic types of narcissism. They are very reluctant to acknowledge that their self-esteem rests on the approval of other people. That neurotic form of narcissism we mentioned earlier, which would kind of get more of like the feelings of emptiness and those sorts of things, they are all about needing the approval of others. One of the consistent things that my work in that area has shown is that almost any area of contingency you can think of, people with that neurotic form of narcissism are saying, yes, I need that sort of validation and affirmation, whether it's about approval from others, if it's about having a job that's high prestige, if it's about having a lot of money, anything, having attractive romantic partners, anything that we looked at, basically, people with that neurotic form of narcissism seem to be saying, I want this sort of affirmation and my self-esteem rests on it. For the other types of narcissism, it was much more selective. Competition was a big thing for the extroverted and antagonistic, but not the approval of others. They were very kind of standoffish and unwilling to say that their self-esteem rested on their parents or other family members approving other people in general. And I think this could be important for understanding some of these racial ethnic differences as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, thank you. So we're at the end of the hour. For folks that want to connect with you, this resonated with you, or they want to hear more about you and what you're doing in your research, can you tell us how we can find you?
Sure. So probably the best way to look at some of the research I've been doing is my website. It's zeiglerhill.com, Zeiglerhill.com. Or you can send me an email at zeiglerh@oakland.edu.
All right, awesome. And thank you so much for coming on and enlightening us about this topic.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, so now that you've heard our discussion, my discussion with Dr. Hill, let me know what your thoughts are. What do you think about what he had to say about the research and your thoughts on what you would like to add just in general on narcissism in the Black community and what you may have noticed? So I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments, and your questions. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves. Thanks for listening and be well.